This is a different type of video I'm going to do. It's a bit darker than normal. So if you are triggered at all, be warned. Yes, you will not see me cover gunto or military type swords from World War II. It's a personal opinion and you may disagree, but I do not like the, I don't know what the word is, energy, the spirit of that particular time in history. I'll put a picture up of one of my first real swords that I owned as a teenager. It was a Guntō World War II sword, a military sword. And of course I didn't know any of the history about it. I didn't study anything to know the atrocities that could have been behind it. Having said that, obviously any type of old Edo period sword, whatever period it's from, it could be 100 years old, 700 years old. I've had swords that old. We don't know the history. We don't know what that sword did, how many lives it could have taken, or none. It may have barely been unsheathed. It may have been a ceremonial sword. We just don't know. And the same with World War II swords, World War I swords. I just can't bring myself to own those because I know now the history of the atrocities in mass casualties that those swords inflicted. They were tools of death. I'm going to read to you a little bit about the dark side of Bushido, which you don't hear very often. And I think it's important to be aware that when we hear the Bushido code, we think about heroes and Ronin samurai saving a young damsel in distress or something. There's many, many more dark sides to Bushido, which are quite disgusting and things that I often don't even bring up. Things that maybe subconsciously I'm pushing back. I see Bushido as a positive message in today's world to stay strong, but we live in relatively a very peaceful time compared to what I'm about to read you. Here's something written by Fred Borch from the military trials of war criminals in the Netherlands in 1946. He writes, as Japan continued its modernization into the early 20th century, her armed forces became convinced that success in battle would be assured if Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen had the spirit of Bushido. The result was that the Bushido code of behavior, which inculcated into the Japanese soldier as part of his basic training, each soldier was indoctrinated to accept that it was the greatest honor to die for the emperor, and it was cowardly to surrender to the enemy. Bushido therefore explains why the Japanese soldiers who were stationed in the NEI so mistreated the POWs in their custody. Those who had surrendered to the Japanese, regardless of how courageously or honorably they had fought, merited nothing but contempt. They had forfeited all honor and literally deserving nothing. Consequently, when the Japanese murdered POWs by shooting them, beheading them, and drowning them, these acts were excused since they involved the killing of men who had forfeited all rights to be treated with dignity or respect. While civilian internees were certainly in a different category from POWs, it is reasonable to think that there were spillover effects from the tenets of Bushido. So you can see here, and I'm looking at photos of atrocities in the Sino War, World War II against the Chinese, the events of the 1930s and 1940s. And I'm going to read you one other thing here about war crimes. War crimes are a real thing. No culture, no country is excused from it. They happen even now, but back then the numbers were staggeringly impossible to believe. I can't even fathom as a human being what it would take to make someone do these types of acts, but with enough indoctrination, I believe that any human can be corrupted easily. Just a note on a few war crimes. The armed forces during the 1930s and 40s are also often compared to the Nazi Germany of 1933 to 45 because of the sheer scale of destruction and suffering caused by each. Much of the controversy regarding Japan's role in World War II revolves around the death rates of prisoners of war and civilians under the Japanese occupation. Historians have written that War crimes are difficult for interesting reasons which have to do with Western perceptions. Both Americans and Europeans fell into the unfortunate habit of seeing World War I and World War II as separate wars, failing to comprehend that they were interlaced in a multitude of ways. Now, if I look down here, according to Werner Gruhl, a historian, approximately 8 million Chinese civilian deaths were attributed to Japanese aggression. According to the findings in the Tokyo Tribunal, the death rate among prisoners of war was 27.1%. According to British historian Mark Felton, officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy ordered the deliberate sadistic murders of more than 20,000 Allied seamen and countless civilians in cold-blooded defiance of the Geneva Convention. At least 12,500 British soldiers and 7,500 Australian soldiers were murdered. The Japanese Navy sank Allied merchants and Red Cross vessels, then murdered the survivors floating in the sea or in their lifeboats. During naval landing parties, the Japanese Navy rounded up, raped, and massacred civilians. Some of them were fed to sharks. Often, many were killed by sledgehammer, bayonet, crucifixion, drowning, hanging, and beheaded by gunto sword. I won't go further. It's disgusting. So you can see that this is my personal view. I don't collect gunto swords. I don't own any. I've sold the one or two that I've had over my life. We, again, don't know what these swords might have done. None of us know. But I cannot, in my consciousness and morality, own a weapon of war that I know the chances are high that some terrible things happen with it. Now, I don't believe in the spirit of a sword or that there's bad stuff going on spiritually there, but I don't have to have those in my collection. I collect swords not as some evil thing or weird. I just collect them because I love them. I like to use them in my martial arts practice every day. I like to learn about different cultures, even the dark side of atrocities. I study Bushido. I try to live by it. I fail. I try as best I can to bring peace to the world, even though I'm working in violence and martial arts in some ways. I'm also teaching many people, and I've had countless stories of how many people have stopped bullies or stood up for themselves or led a stronger and happier life through the martial arts and Bushido code. Morally, I can't collect those swords, so that's a question and an answer now of my opinion on why I don't collect these gunto swords. That is not to stop anyone from doing anything out there. You do what you want to do. I'll do what I want to do. But my collection is of historic significance and also moral significance, if I can put that in there. I know it's a dark video, something I don't like to do because it kind of brings the heebie-jeebies about. It's just kind of a gross subject. These sides of history must be addressed so that we don't live in some fantasy world that these samurai were always beautiful and noble and heroic. They were often evil and cruel and tools of their own culture and ignorance. And we must see both sides, the yin-yang of anything, in order to understand the full picture and bring about what we're going to use it for in our own current life. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your time. Take care, and bye-bye.